Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. From yours truly, also known as the person of iniquity, comes the obvious question: have we, for the first time ever, set our friend in the United States, Richard S. Kazimer, a challenge that is truly mission impossible? By the way, before we bother about trivial details like that, if you'd like to be his friend on Facebook, all you need to do is look for Richard S. Kazimer. Kazimer, by the way, spelled Kazimer, and just say, I'd like to be your friend, and he'll say yes to everybody. Anyway, my friend, welcome along.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
We're doing extremely well. Something that I wanted to talk about this morning is something that I must say is very dear to a lot of people's hearts. Now, I don't know whether it's the same issue in the United States, but in more recent times with the advent of technology, like, for example, mobile phones, and more specifically SMS or short message servicing and stuff like that, it's seen the development of a new language. For example, mate written as M followed by the letter 8, or great written as GR followed by the letter 8. Little things like that. Later, L8R. Stuff like that. Many people believe that that's the thin end of the wedge. It's the start of the true and inevitable decline of the English language, and that has got to be a bad thing. There are many people who express that opinion here. What about on your side of the Pacific?
Well, since the invention of the written language, humans have always sought ways to truncate phrasing, if for no other reason than to get our point across faster than the person we're conversing with. SMS and texting is just the latest incarnation in that, and is in any cell phone plan, time is indeed money, as is the amount of messages one sends. Now, if you've seen how much a certain member of my household racks up in monthly text messaging fees, less turns out to be more in
Richard, I've got one word of caution before we go any further. Divorces are always expensive.
Don't I know?
Bearing that in mind, please carry on.
Well, by virtue of the technology and format, short message service, which is SMS, that protocol is standard on all cell phones. Limited keyboard text function and human dexterity has produced the need for us to create a hybrid language using acronyms, symbols, abbreviations, slang, and just plain poor grammar to get our points across. Now, is texting corrupting English as we know it? Well, it depends on whom you're talking to. Each generation has its own slang. Each culture and region has its own colloquialisms. But the basics of the Fowler Brothers, the King's English, remains as the fundamental root of modern English, as is the Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White. Whether we choose to learn it and use it, that's a matter of choice, or an indication of the state of our educational system. Now, what I found out is that linguists see the language of texting as a fad that will pass as social networks like Twitter and current cell phone technology becomes obsolete, which is in about 5 minutes. Educators, on the other hand, especially those being held accountable for the steady decline in test scores and reading and writing comprehension, are very quick to blame the culture of technology for their own failings to produce articulate students.
Well, I suppose if you can blame the technology, then you don't have to accept any of the responsibility for your own failings, which I guess for somebody who might be failing is actually a convenient excuse. But I suppose in some respects what people might argue is, okay, it might be a passing fad, and as technology moves into the next phase, this may disappear because, of course, you might start to go down the path of voice recognition and stuff like that, so the need for this shorthand will disappear. But they might argue that what it leaves behind is people who have a substandard appreciation of the language. Now, of course, it does not take into account the fact that we have been dumbing down our education system in our respective countries for a long time, but it does also reflect, does it not, especially when you talk about the fact that people might blame the technology, it does also reflect the fact that we don't want to accept responsibility for our own failings.
In the history of this country, at least, I can recall African-American ebonics was once cited as a sign of the destruction of American English, as was the patois of valley girls, hippies, and beatniks that all came before, and I'm old enough to remember all of that. And yet, no matter what our generation, we still use the same texting language for the single purpose of texting. We don't use it to speak or write outside of that medium. So rarely do fad-created symbols become an effective way of communicating, and all we need to do is ask the artist formerly and still known as Prince how that little stunt worked out.
Not successfully.
Indeed.
The interesting point about all of this is that many people lament it, and it's quite interesting that here I should be sitting as an Australian talking to an American about the English language, because both of us, for different reasons, by somebody who truly speaks Queen's English, would say that we both kill the language. I kill the language. I've got a shocking Australian accent. You've got a very obvious American accent. Somebody sitting there speaking very, very, very Queen's English would be saying, you two blokes are disgusting. Well, they wouldn't use blokes as a term for a start. It would be something along the lines of, you gentlemen are a disgrace to the language.
Guilty as charged. As I say, you certainly wouldn't know it by my contributions to this program. I've also spent a good portion of my professional career as a writer in various forms and mediums. In essence, I are a writer, as we say. But you're right. I mean, a few things irritate me more in a professional environment than poor grammar, misspellings, and improper punctuation. So again, kids, listen to your Uncle Richard. Do as I say, not as I doesn't.
Yeah, well, see, here's the interesting point, Uncle Richard. Even when it comes down to spelling, we can take the same words with the same meaning, and you and I spell them differently.
Absolutely. And when I write for the Australian press,
yes,
I use the Australian or the UK dictionary to write properly.
Well, actually, it's
I love language. It's just wonderful.
It's actually interesting because I quite often get emails, as you know, from people in the United States, and I now do the conversions to American language. If I make a reference to a mobile phone, I instantly know to say to a cell. Not to say a car park, to say a parking lot. I wouldn't say a shopping centre, I should say a shopping mall. It's funny how, without even thinking now, you instantly know how to do the translations, and I've read stories from the United States, which of course I Australianise. If we're talking about a parking lot, I always say the car park. Now, the fact of the matter is I could say a parking lot and I'd say 100% of people would know what I'm talking about, but you just tend to do those sort of things instantly. And because of that, I do wonder whether the whole language thing, even when we're talking about SMS, really matters. I mean, I remember asking one of my nieces via SMS how the trip that she'd taken was, and she replied back, it was a CWOT. And I thought, CWOT? So anyway, I decided to do a bit of searching. Because you see, of course I could have SMS back and said, pardon. I could have done that. But you don't think Uncle Chris was going to, for a moment, admit that he didn't know. So I looked up an SMS dictionary, and guess what, mate? I worked it out. Do you know what CWOT is?
No, what is it?
Complete waste of time.
All right.
Well, it was an acronym.
Well, to that end, I found an interview with linguist David Crystal about texting ruining the English language, and what Crystal found was that the average text only abbreviates about 10% of the message, meaning 90% is standard spelling. Most of the abbreviations are the same ones that we have been using for several hundred years. Crystal also asked school children whether they would use textisms in their writings, and to a child, his question was seen as ludicrous. The kids completely knew the difference between texting and essay styles, and the teachers also reported they had never seen answers in text form. I found another article that cited a teacher who said that texting has had a tremendous impact on spelling, mainly with children dropping letters and punctuation, whereas a 10th grader said that she thought texting improved her spelling because of her cell phone's predictive spelling feature. Now, if the word is spelled incorrectly, it didn't come up, and that forced the girl to find the proper spelling to complete the message.
Gotcha, yeah.
A positive and a negative on that.
I suppose part of the problem is that many of the people who are critical of the technology perhaps don't understand it. But I think one of the points that you also made is we all have language, and we all had almost a subculture, particularly in our youth, that was unique to our youth of that particular period. There were slang terms that we used, and they had meanings. You then move on to the next generation. They had their own terms. When you listen to them talking, you think, what they're talking about. It took you a while to get a handle on what they were talking about. But I think that all generations have had it to a greater or lesser extent, but always to a different way to the succeeding generation. And that's perhaps something that we fail to understand. This is arguably something that's been, certainly I think for most of the 20th century has gone on, and arguably probably happened for centuries before that.
Look at examples like semaphore and Morse code. It doesn't matter where you are on the planet, the dots and dashes and the signaling is exactly the same. And I think SMS and texting language is exactly the same. It's kind of universal. universal. How long it's going to be around is anyone's guess, although there is going to be a short shelf life on this just based on the technology alone.
Yeah, well, of course, what's going to happen, I suppose, is ultimately we're going to end up at voice recognition software. So therefore, texting in the sense of using fingers to punch out letters on a keyboard is going to become immaterial, because we'll just simply say, okay, message to Richard, see you at 4:30, and the phone will just print that out and it'll come out the other end as a text.
Sure. I did find a good website. It's www.netlingo, netlingo.com.
Yeah.
And it's great for parents to jump on there and find all the acronyms that their kids are using. And also, if you're like me, that a little long in a tooth, it's good for me to go on and find out what it means when my daughter texts me, or even my wife as well. I think one of the biggest issues, though, is that texting while driving. Studies have shown that texting while driving diminishes concentration that is equal to, if not more, than drink driving and driving tired. Now, the state of Massachusetts, where I live, recently enacted a law making it illegal for anyone to text while driving. It's also illegal for teenagers to use a cell phone while behind the wheel.
Well, it's illegal for anyone here to use a mobile phone while they're driving. It's as simple as that. The only time you can talk on a mobile phone while you're driving is if you have an approved hands-free kit in the car, which means the phone has to sit in a cradle, you press a button to answer it, and you drive along with both hands of the wheel talking, and it comes through a speaker system. That's the bottom line, and that applies right across the country.
It's a good idea, considering the amount of accidents we've had.
Can I also point out, if you don't mind, it's one of the most ineffective laws I've ever seen. There is not a time that I take to the road that I don't see somebody using their mobile phone, including texting. And, of course, like a lot of things, speed cameras and all that other non-policeman present technology that's employed to manage road safety and road issues and speeding and what have you, does not catch people using their mobile phones. It does not catch bad driving, so that's I guess a separate issue. But interestingly, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, there are going to be further issues, I guess, in technology has changed and the effect that might have on language. How much? Well, we touched on this at the beginning a bit. But how much do you believe that the teaching profession as a collective is using excuses like, for example, people using SMS language on phones as a reason why they're not performing as well with their English and language skills as they should be? How much do you think that's the teaching profession blaming that for their own failings, as opposed to that being the real cause?
When you look at the dwindling test scores in our country that have been prevalent for a number of years, this is just another excuse. It doesn't hold water. Nobody's buying it. We have a fundamental problem with our educational system. We have an outcome-based education system where a lot of kids are fast-tracked and mainstream to get them onto the next level and out of the incapable hands of the previous teacher. So there is that problem. I don't think that blaming text messaging on the outcome-based education is going to be any more valid than clothing, fast food, you name it. It all boils down to what are the kids learning, who's teaching, are the teachers qualified? So really, I don't think that that's going to wash at all. The teachers need to be held accountable.
Do you find there is a reluctance among the teaching profession to even consider the possibility that they might be accountable? Is there that reluctance in the United States the same as there is here?
We've had that in the past. President Obama has been very much in the forefront on holding teachers accountable. In Massachusetts alone, schools that are not performing are being defunded and closed until they shape up. There is a sense of accountability here in the United States. Whether or not it's going to be effective is anyone's guess, but there has been a day of reckoning.
Yeah, I suppose it's always going to go down in the future, isn't it? How much of it also is the fact that in many particular instances, and often if you speak to teachers, and I think one of the things that they sometimes raise, which is pretty fair, is the possibility that they don't ever want to consider that there might be an issue with their child. You know, if there's something wrong, then it's got to be somebody else's fault. It can't be their child's. It's often described here as everybody's out of step but my little Johnny. Is there still a bit of a problem with that in the US?
It's indicative of the education system since somebody cracked open a book and hit somebody in the knuckles with a ruler. Yeah, and nobody wants to be accountable for their own failings, whether it's a teacher or a parent. The teachers can only teach so much, and then it's the child's responsibility to do their lessons. It's the parent's responsibility to make sure that that child does the lessons. Now, if there's a breakdown between the time the child sits down in the classroom and then goes home and then returns returns to the classroom, either prepared or unprepared, there is an overall accountability, and it's three-pronged. It's the teacher, it's the student, it's the parents. There are a lot of factors of single parents, poor health, poor environment, you name it, but you've got to keep pulling these kids out from between the cracks. But again, everybody is responsible for some facet of their own education and their own learning process. You can't blame a cell phone or technology for your own inability to read or comprehend. Somebody has to do the job, and we're all responsible for moving on to the next level. I think one of the biggest problems here in the United States is that there is so little time for that one-on-one tutoring between a teacher and student. Classroom time has diminished. It used to be an hour. Now it's down to probably a half an hour. Student-to-teacher ratio has doubled in the past few years, so there really isn't a lot of time, and if you don't swim with with the fish, you're going to be left behind, and that's a fundamental problem we've experienced for many, many years.
Over the years, I mean, when we start to talk about things, and for example, I guess what we're focusing on specifically this morning is the English language, is there a strong argument to say that the English language has truly deteriorated and people's comprehension of it in schools has truly deteriorated in recent times? I mean, forgetting about any argument as to the source of that, just that broad statement, is that a fair statement?
I don't think that students are encouraged to write as much as in years past, or even read as much as in years past. We're pulling a lot of information from the internet, from blogs, and from unqualified sources, and that seems to be good enough. As I mentioned, I keep using the term outcome-based education. We're lowering the standards, so if a B was a passing grade, D is now the passing grade. And I think that that's one of the fundamental problems, is that we're so used to that whole dumbing down, where the dumbed down version has become the norm, that we've kind of lost the appeal and the excitement of the English language, where abbreviations and slang has become the norm. And if you misspell a word for so many years, it becomes acceptable in a modern dictionary. I don't find any excuse for that.
Yeah, I suppose one of the, and it's always going to be an issue, isn't it? People talk about things evolving, but of course, like you say, one of the problems has been in the education system in many parts of the world that it clearly has been dumbed down. I might add, it's not a term that people within the education industry like to hear, but there is no doubt that the education system by and large has been dumbed down. And of course, what happens is, to use your analogy, when a B was a pass and now a D is a pass, suddenly you've got more people getting C's and D's. Instantly, you can say that the number of people passing has increased. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that term, outcomes-based education. It was something here in West Australia. People, and arguably most of the people who fought hardest, were people from a teaching background against that very principle. They argued that the very things that you talk about happening and say is happening were going to happen here. And what's more, they held up the United States as an example where this system had been implemented and was not working.
I don't want to do a broad brush of the U.S. education system. There are many schools that are doing great things. Children are starting school at a younger age. There are some great private schools. But in general, it's an economic factor. There's a lot of things that we're just not doing what we used to do 20, 30, 40 years ago. The love of the English language has become passé, and I think that that's a sad state of affairs and a sad commentary on the way we speak and the way we communicate.
Well, as you say that, I say thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. If you'd like to be Richard's friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazimer, Kazimer, is how you spell his surname. Thank you very much for your perspective on the English language. We shall have a chat again next week, my friend.
All right, brother. Words are free. Look them up.